Right. We only have about 75 people in so far, and we have 250 registered. So I imagine a lot of people are going to be logging on in the next minute or so. But in the interest of time, uh, allowing you to get on with your day after this is over, I think maybe we should start on time, and people can catch up as they join in. I am Eric Lufer. I'm the president of the Citizens Research Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today on the analysis of Governor Whitmer's fiscal year 2022 budget proposals. This webinar is being presented by the Citizens Research Council of Michigan and MERS. The Citizens Research Council is a statewide nonpartisan public affairs research group. This is our 105th year of operation, a longevity we attribute to our promotion of sound public policy for state and local governments through accurate, independent, and objective research. We are a private not-for-profit organization, and we rely on charitable contributions of foundations, businesses, corporations, and individuals. I'd like to encourage you to join our circle of supporters and help us to continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important policy topics in Michigan. If you value this webinar and the associated work that we do with it, please contribute to the public discourse and help the Citizens Research Council as an objective, independent, credible source of information into the next century. Please consider a contribution. As I said, the webinar is co-sponsored by MERS, and that is a daily news outlet that covers state government and politics in Lansing. John Rurink and Carol Mellon will join us later for the question and answer. Handout file with the slides for the event for this webinar is available for you to follow along. There's a link you can see. You can go to our website and access it. Either click on the events link or you follow that exact string of words to get to it. I know some people like to have that at their disposal to take notes. I want you to note that we're recording this webinar and we'll post it to our webpage afterwards. It takes a little time to process, but it'll be available for future viewing if you want to refer anyone else to that. I want to let you know that we're going to have everybody on mute except for the speakers, and you will not be able to hear you if you do speak. We have received several questions as part of the registration process, and John and Carol will be using those primarily. But if anything requires clarification or anything is really pressing, you can use the questions pane that's available in the GoToWebinar software. We'll follow up offline with any questions that do get asked and are not addressed as part of the presentation. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, please let me know at 734-788-1732. Also, after the webinar, you'll be receiving an email soliciting your feedback, and we'd very much appreciate any feedback you have. This webinar continues the Research Council's long history of analyzing the financial condition of state government and reviewing the governor's executive budgets. Our analysis of the budgets is not done in the context of whether the state is dedicating sufficient resources to specific functions, but to better understand how resources are being allocated and to consider the sustainability of the state's finances. We thank Martin Whitmer for their support in bringing this webinar to you. The state has a lot of money to disperse by supplemental appropriation and budget appropriations right now, but when that money is gone, it will have the same budget pressures that we've been talking about and others, as well as pressures on how schools are funded. The webinar today will be presented to discuss those issues by two members of the Research Council's senior staff. Bob Schneider has just rejoined the staff after spending several years in the State Budget Office. He was a staff member with the Research Council from 2013 to 2015. Before that, he was with the House Fiscal Agency. He has spent time also working with Public Policy Associates and the Michigan Department of State. He'll be joined by Craig Thiel. Craig's been with us since 2006 and currently serves as the Research Director and the Senior Research Associate assigned to education matters. Before coming to the Research Council, Craig worked with the Senate Fiscal Agency and for the House Fiscal agency. Previous to that, he spent some time with the Michigan legislature. Previous to that time with the Michigan legislature, Craig's had positions with the Michigan Department of State Environmental Protection Agency. I encourage everyone to visit our website, crcmich.org, for analysis of public policy issues. You can see some of the things we've addressed recently. At that site, you can sign up for email notifications, or you can text Fax Matter to 42828, and that'll give you the chance to join our email list. So with that, let me get out of the way. Bob and Craig have a great show for you, a lot of information, and I turn it over to Bob. And Bob, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Okay,
we hear
I'm
you.
gonna.
We do hear you.
Okay, all right, thank you. It was I think I was still muted by the system, and now I'm free. So thank you, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Really appreciate you joining us today for our budget webinar. I'm very excited to be back with the Research Council. Very much looking forward to contributing to the, I think, very important mission of this organization. So very happy to be here and to be back with the Research Council. Our plan today is to kind of give you a very high-level overview of the governor's budget recommendation, not only kind of focused on the content of that recommendation, but also an analysis of the bigger picture issues that are shaping the state's budget situation. This year, we thought it was important to start out by taking a look back. 2020 was a year dominated by COVID-19 and COVID-19 response, the impact on the state economy and state revenues, but also clearly significant budget needs to address the COVID-19 pandemic. And that evolving budget response, both at the state level and at the federal level, really sets the framework for where we're at now. So we're going to start. Let's look at the state budget actions from last year that shaped the budget situation today. The first couple slides I'm going to do really quickly to remind us how rapidly the pandemic kind of hit us last year. I like, John and Kyle will like to hear this. I find the mirror search functionality to be a great source of legislative and policy research sometimes. And I went back and just kind of searched and dug up coverage from early last year on COVID. First reference to COVID or coronavirus that I saw was this June 24th bullet that I have here. A few Michiganders getting tested for the first test cases for novel coronavirus. Just 2 weeks after that, February 6th, Governor Whitmer released her FY21 budget proposal. That recommendation, utilized a very large GF and school aid fund balance. I looked at that proposal. I searched the budget book. Nowhere in that proposal is there the word COVID or coronavirus. As of that time, it was really not on anyone's radar as a huge issue as of quite yet. And then by the end of February, I noted the February 27th reporting, Dr. Caldoun, the state's chief medical officer, testifying in the Senate. I think concerns were starting to grow, but no alarm yet at that time. That changed quickly in the first 2 weeks of March. March 3rd, the governor announces the creation of some coronavirus task force. And then particularly March 10th, we have our first presumed positive cases. And the governor declares a state of emergency. At that time, we had already seen cases in other states. Within 2 days, on March 12th, the governor announces the closure of K-12 schools. Universities all move online. The next day, we start to see the orders affecting large gatherings, and on March 16th, we saw the first order closing some businesses with restaurants, bars, coffee shops, and the like. In terms of the state budget, by the end of the month, the governor had begun to propose state funding to address the coronavirus, and we had a proposed supplemental that involved a legislative agreement with the governor to veto $157 million from a previous budget deal that had been arranged earlier in the month, and our first direct funding for coronavirus, $100 million for a general state response to coronavirus needs, and $50 million dedicated for healthcare system capacity, as hospitals were just beginning to see and be overloaded basically with coronavirus patients. The legislature granted the administration's request for receive and expend authority in the budget as well. So when we got new federal stimulus that we knew was coming, it could be quickly appropriated and tapped into. The federal government at that time then began to provide massive resources to the states to help with the coronavirus issue. The first of those was $3.1 million that came to the state of Michigan, and another $800 million to our largest local units of government from the Coronavirus Relief Fund. We used that along with Bullet 2 once the federal declaration of emergency was declared for Michigan at the end of March. FEMA support became available. Importantly there, while that generally requires a 25% match, guidance from FEMA allowed CRF funds, the initial $3.1 billion to Michigan, to be used as match. So really we had two large pots of federal revenue that we could use to address COVID-19 needs. We began to use those for testing, personal protection equipment, hazard pay for frontline workers, the healthcare response in the private sector, as we'll see momentarily, that those funds also were greatly helpful in mitigating the FY20 shortfall that was developing. The federal government also provided enhanced Medicaid match. Those of you familiar with the Medicaid program, it's a joint federal state financed program to provide healthcare coverage for low-income and vulnerable Michigan residents. The federal government boosted its share of those costs by 6.2%, made that retroactive to the beginning of 2020, and that ended up contributing over $500 million in state budget relief to Michigan in fiscal year 20, and continues to this day. And testing funds came in from the CDC, $316 million provided in May that got the state a jump on testing, contact tracing, and expanding laboratory capacity. So in terms of the state budget, all eyes were focused on May. Clearly, COVID-19 was having a major impact on the state economy, and thus as well on state revenues. Every year, as background, the economists from the Department of Treasury, the legislative fiscal agencies hold consensus revenue conferences that help set revenue parameters used for budgeting. And as expected in May, the news was very bad. We had, as federal stimulus plans were still being worked on and not finalized, the projection was a loss of revenue of about $5.5 billion across both of our major state funds. In particular, revenue losses specifically for FY2020 were $3.2 billion, $3.2 billion, and that was going to necessitate per the Constitution, budget reductions, immediate budget reductions, to address our budget shortfall, and that was coming, of course, when we were 8 months in already to FY2020 by May. So significant budget cutting was coming. How did we deal with that? Well, one, we had fund balances available. That meant the budget hole to fill was about $2.4 billion after that May consensus revenue estimating conference. As you see, the response to that leaned heavily on the federal support that we had received. So the first two rows here show $1.1 billion of that shortfall was covered with coronavirus relief fund money. That was basically public safety staff, state police, corrections, K-12 payments, higher education, local revenue sharing, our direct COVID response at the state level, things where the normal course of business had been transformed by the coronavirus. We used CRF money at the state level to backfill for general fund, and that helped fill $1.6 billion of the hole when you combine that with the enhanced Medicaid match. That federal stimulus support from the Medicaid match and from coronavirus relief fund was about filled about two-thirds of that budget hole that we had seen coming out of the consensus conference. The other pieces were filled in by a withdrawal from the budget stabilization fund. That was $350 million. That left about $450 million to cover by other state budget reductions. Virtually all of that was one-time work project cancellations, one-time fund shifts, the use of temporary hiring freeze and layoff savings from the state. But in general, was their budget paying from these? Yes, but the state largely avoided the types of deep budget cuts that were initially feared after that May revenue conference. In August, with the FY20 budget balanced, we got good news as focus turned to addressing now back to the FY21 budget. The revenue picture here was greatly enhanced. If you look at the gold bars here, that's the May 20 revenue estimates for general fund on the left, school aid fund on the right, and then in black, the new revised August estimates. What we essentially found was for FY20, after having just cut the budget, we got $2.3 billion in revenue back. Basically, the amount that we cut was restored in terms of enhanced revenue estimates. That all then falls to the FY20 year-end balance, since we had already made the cuts to reflect what we had thought was going to be a dramatic revenue loss. Also, another 500 plus million in additional revenue for fiscal year 21. That made resolving the FY21 budget picture much easier. School aid fund actually had a surplus. Craig's going to take us through some education highlights shortly, but that allowed for some FY21 investments in K-12 and community colleges. We use the school aid fund balance to help subsidize the general fund, and with that, an enhanced Medicaid match, we basically had a balanced budget, and that allowed for some significant investments, offset by significant GF reductions, but with some of that stuff we had already leaned on for FY20. That left, as some of the federal stimulus started to come to an end, with the CRF set to expire at the end of 2020, and as we awaited a new round of federal stimulus, in December, a supplemental was passed for some additional direct state COVID response, with some of that remaining general fund as well, before the close of the fiscal year. So then all eyes began to turn to FY22 budget development and the January consensus, again with the legislative and treasury economists getting together in January. Again, we saw a significant upgrade in the revenue situation. Even better news, the general fund and school aid fund up almost $2 billion. Again, here you see the blue estimates from January 2020, the prior year, and now the new white estimates are the January 2021 forecast. You'll see revenues at this last January consensus were much closer, really, to those original January estimates from 12 months before than they were to those to those August estimates. We saw a significant upgrade in both the general fund and the school aid fund. So let's talk about what happened. First, what happens in the economy. This looks at wage and salary employment, wage and salary income, and then personal income, and you'll see how those projections evolved. The dark blue bars that start each of those segments are the January 2020 forecasts. So in January 2020, about 14 months ago, before the onset of COVID, we were expecting some slight growth in wage and salary employment, 0.6%, 4% growth in wages and salaries, 3.7% in personal income in Michigan. Those projections plummeted after COVID, but while wage and salary employment held, we still lost, when we look at final data, about 421,000 jobs in 2020 when compared to 2019, down to about 9.5%. We saw less decline in wage and salary income, and I think the story behind that is who was impacted by job losses. Well, it was more focused in service sectors, retail, in some of the lower wage service sector industries. So those who lost their jobs were on the lower end of the pay scale than the average person in Michigan. And then in personal income, it was actually a banner year. 6% growth in personal income. I look back at historical data that had happened. We'd had personal income growth, and this is in actual dollar terms, of 6% only twice before in the last 25 years. What drove that? I think largely, almost entirely, it was the enhanced unemployment benefits provided by the federal government. So where folks had lost their jobs, the unemployment benefits, particularly the enhancement offered as part of the federal stimulus, in some cases not only made up for the lost income, but some folks actually had a higher income with the unemployment benefits than with their traditional job. So personal income grew greatly. That meant that our revenue estimates and this is the FY20 estimates, shows how significantly that those forecasts changed. Again, both for our major two taxes, the personal income tax and the sales tax. The final projections from the most recent projections from January 2021 looked a lot more like the January 2020 projections than those dire May 2020 projections that we led with here. Again, what helped? The enhanced UI benefits from the federal government, Paycheck Protection Program, helping maintain jobs and income. The federal stimulus checks obviously helped keep incomes and sales tax healthy, and then the gradual reopening of the economy helped mitigate those revenue losses that were projected in May. So now let's move to FY22. And we're going to start and look at the situation that's facing the state, which is very healthy fund surpluses in both the general fund and the school aid fund. Again, we cut budgets in anticipation of losing tremendous revenue. In reality, we ended up realizing a lot of those early losses in revenue. They actually didn't come to fruition, and we had a lot more revenue on hand than was anticipated. Combined, $3.5 billion in fund balances will carry into FY21. I should note here, as well as I do in the slide, the Biden administration has given states guidance that their intent is to maintain the enhanced Medicaid match through the end of calendar year 2021. So that should give us some significant savings as well in the current budget year. With all the one-time revenue, much of the action in the FY22 budget proposal that came out for the governor is going to be it was in a series of supplemental recommendations. And we're going to talk in more detail about each of these in the presentation here. $2.5 billion in an education supplemental, over $4 billion in federal aid for COVID response, and then we also have significant GF funding proposals, including business relief and some infrastructure investments. The ongoing FY22 budget recommendation is the governor's proposal calls for an increase in 6.4% in the overall budget. The state budget now is close to $66 billion. A lot of that driven by almost 10% growth in federal revenues, which obviously derive out of the federal stimulus that we received. There's 5% growth in general fund general purpose appropriations, and again, if we take a look at the pieces of that increase on the next slide, we'll see about half of the increases, both from general fund and school aid fund, are earmarked for one-time investment needs. So almost $600 million in one-time general fund proposals for FY22 and $266 million in the school aid fund. When you look at ongoing investments, Craig's going to talk momentarily about some of the activity in the school aid fund. That $193 million in ongoing GF investments. 121 million of that is actually tied to a single investment related to continuing the direct care worker wage increase that was put in the budget. So even much of that is tied into an individual investment that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. So with that, we're going to turn to discuss some of the details of the budget proposal. I'm going to turn the screen over to Craig Thiel, who's going to talk about some of the education-related investments. And I need to make Craig the presenter, and I have to remember how to do that. Oh, here it is. So I'm going to turn it over to Craig and give him the screen. So go ahead, Craig, and you can begin when you're ready.
All right, technology is working. This is great. Yeah, it's great to have Bob back. We started our careers in state government in the House Fiscal Agency in 1996, and just proof positive that everything comes full circle in life. So I'm going to do a little history lesson as well related to the education budgets, diving in a little deeper and what Bob has offered. And let me get our screens up to the right one here. All right, and just to recap, the 2020 budget for education held harmless from cuts. Bob mentioned a lot of that had to do with the uncertainty that was going on, but also the fact that we were multiple months into the fiscal year. But still, with the plummeting revenues, there had to be some adjustments in the budgets, and federal dollars replaced state funding across all three budgets, K through 12, community colleges, and the higher ed budget. Those were dollar for dollar swaps. The rainy day fund chipped in about $300 million to the school aid fund to help keep spending at the agreed to levels, as well as an increase in the general fund transfer. There were small, what I would call operational increases in all three education budgets for 2020, and those were maintained. And as Bob pointed out, with these budget balancing, it largely resulted in massive general fund school aid supplementals. The work on the FY21 budget, at least in the education sphere, was large, and the result of that was largely a flat funding or a current services baseline. We didn't see any ongoing operational funding increases for K-12 schools, colleges, and universities. There was a one-time $65 per pupil adjustment. The budget replaced the massive amount of federal funds with the school aid funds, so kind of got the 21 budget back on a current services baseline in terms of its revenue sources. There was an increase of $66 million to address declining enrollment districts. The state had recognized that the people weren't showing up to their public schools, charters, and traditional. This was going to, because of the way we fund schools, this was going to have a material impact on district budgets. So a modification of how we counted students to ensure that there wasn't this massive, slide in revenue. So that's what that $66 million represents. So kind of with a baseline budget in place, most of the attention on the 21 spending was kind of kicked over into the supplemental debate that's going on right now. Specifically for schools, the money that we're talking about is the money that came out of the coronavirus response and relief supplemental appropriation. Michigan is poised to receive about $1.8 billion from the federal government from this. This is about 4 times the amount that Michigan received for K-12 education under the CARES Act last spring. So, if we look at it just on a pure per student level, CARES provided about about $187 per kid in Michigan. The CRRSA, the December package, that number is about $850 per kid across the state. Congress has decided, like they did with the CARES Act, to send about $1.5 billion of that money directly to school districts based on the federal Title I formula. The state of Michigan and other states do have some discretionary pots of money. In Michigan's case, it totals about $205 million. Both sources of these federal funds, the formula dollars, the Title I formula dollars, as well as the discretionary funds, are kind of tied up in these competing supplemental appropriations, as well as additional state funding that would be layered on top of the federal funding to address school needs. And there's key differences between what the governor has proposed and what has the legislative Republican leadership has proposed. I would point out that schools, as we speak, are pulling together their plans for reopening this spring. Many of them, March 1 was a reopening date. Others, this next week coming up, as well as they're doing all their programming right now, planning for what they're going to do in the summer to address the learning delays and learning losses that students experience. So what's going on in Lansing in terms of budget decisions have a material effect on local school decisions, especially because of the size of this relief. So what I've done in this next slide is try to give you a sense of how this COVID supplemental would impact the overall K-12 spend in Michigan, as well as looking at it relative to where we were in 2020. As Bob mentioned, 2020, most of the COVID-related appropriations across state budget were federal funds, and we can see that on the FY20 bar here. The federal COVID lines, it's yellow. There's that represents roughly the $350 million that came to the state for K-12. None of that COVID money was programmed and we weren't aware of it in 21 when the budget was passed. And now the governor is proposing a supplemental for schools that totals about $2.4 billion. That appropriates all the available federal funding, the Title I money, but also all of the discretionary pot of money that's available. Additionally, she is proposing state investment, again, to be layered on top of the federal investment for various programs. Pandemic learning, that would be current year funding, student recovery this year and into the summer, and then as well as out of school programs, both for the current school year and this summer. Contrast that with the legislative Republicans' proposal, which clocks in at about 1.9 billion. Again, all the available federal funding is in this proposal. That's about 1.6 billion. However, only 650, roughly 650 million of that amount is going to go out without condition. 840 million of that is tie-barred to another piece of legislation that would shift some of the authority for closing schools from the Department of Health and Human Services Director over to local health departments. The legislative proposal also includes about 200 million of that discretionary funding that's available to the state, and only layers on top about 170 million of state funding. Primarily that money, that state money, is used to equalize the per pupil student allocations that are coming from the federal government under Title I. And then there are also some programs for student recovery and out of school programs that are in the Senate or in the legislative Republicans. So right now, this is kind of a picture of what these two proposals look like. And then as Bob, I think, briefly mentioned, there is a large tranche of money that's pegged for K through 12 education in President Biden's 1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. I'll just point out this would be the third federal relief package for public schools in less than a year. The total spending for Michigan coming from that, as best as we can discern, is about 6.2 billion. So this would bring to the total Michigan's share of the federal relief to 6.2 billion. And again, nearly 90% of this money, the first two relief packages and then adding in the Biden plan, nearly 90% would go out through this federal Title I formula directly to districts. I'm pointing out here that that 6.2 billion figure compared to what the feds sent us during the last recession to help K through 12 schools in federal relief was about 1.5 billion. So we're talking more than 4 times as large of a federal investment in schools. And some challenges with this federal funding that I think it's important to keep in mind is, again, nearly all the money is allocated to states and districts directly through this Title I formula. And because they're using the Title I formula to allocate, we see these huge differences in per student allocations. I mean, everything from 100-fold increase between some districts at the top and some districts at the bottom in terms of per student funding. The state has limited control over the funds that aren't coming down through the federal formula, but there's a lot of money there. There's across all 3 plans, there's about 700 million. Again, coming out of the Biden plan, there's more than 400 million alone that we can expect coming to the state, which the state will decide how to use this. And these massive funding disparities are problematic because the pandemic has had kind of a universal impact on K through 12 schools in the state. All schools were shut down last spring, and then again in November. The procedures for opening are largely the same, regardless of where you are in the state in terms of school, what kind of school, the size. All students have been affected at some level by the learning disruptions, but this formula does not guarantee that each student receives a base amount of funding. It's a tool that's been used for decades as a compensatory funding system for K through 12, not for kind of base level funding of student needs during different crises. I'm pointing out here that and this is across all three packages, so we've added up the district allocations across all three federal packages, the two that have already hit the state and the one in Biden's plan. The median district will see about $3,400 per pupil, but 100 districts are in the state. 100 of the roughly 800 are going to receive less than $1,000 per student. Some at the top, such as Flint, will receive about $42,000 per pupil. This is $158 million across all three plans, more than 2.5 times the district's annual budget. So we're talking about some significant resource investment. Detroit Public Schools Community District, they've regularly have received about 1/4 of the state's overall allocation of Title I. So that's across these three plans will be about $27,000. And analysis that we've done has also shown that there's wide funding variances across very similar neighboring schools. So I did an analysis that looked at schools in Wayne County, both factoring in Detroit's funding, Detroit Public Schools Community District, and then pulling that piece out. And so what we've seen is that charter schools that are operating in the city of Detroit are receiving a fraction of the funding that DPS schools are receiving through these federal relief packages. And this last bullet, that the state should use these state and federal discretionary resources to ensure that all students receive a base amount of funding. So, the money that's going out to the districts such as Flint and DPS are in need of those resources, but the real concern is those districts that are neglected by the formula, and ensuring that they have some base level of funding to respond to the needs. So let's take a step back here real quick, talking about this massive federal influx. It's about 1/3 of the total K-12 outlay in a year. If you just take the money and think that it's going to be spent over 4 years, that's about $1.5 billion annually. I went back and we've never seen an investment in K through 12 finances in Michigan of that size ever. So we're talking about a historic investment. We're also talking about a major pandemic, and the demands are significant. But for a handful of these districts, those that are receiving the largest sums, this money is going to represent just transformative funding amounts in terms of being able to address needs that previously were probably considered, very difficult to address, I would say. The question for them will be, are they going to be able to leverage some of this federal funding to address the student learning needs that have plagued those districts, even before the pandemic. Also, we have to start giving some thought to what, how districts are going to be spending this money. It is one time in nature, and districts are fully aware of that. So they'll be hiring new staff, they'll be hiring contractors, new programs, they'll be investing in facilities, HVAC, air conditioning, but how are these decisions on spending going to interact with existing challenges in school districts, as far as teacher shortages, ability to hire contractors to do HVAC improvements? There's going to be a real pinch point in some areas of the state, as all this money is chasing more or less the same service suppliers. Although it is one time, I've done some modeling, and these are numbers that come out from the Congressional Budget Office that estimate over the next 10-year period how the money will be spent. The CBO, as you can see, thinks that the vast majority of the CARES Act money will be spent by the end of FY22. So this is federal fiscal 22, which aligns with our state fiscal year. The supplemental bill from last December, the $1.8 billion that's working its way through our legislature, however, gets kind of strewn out over a 4-year period when we see a decline after FY24 in the spend down of those resources. And then as the Congressional Budget Office took a look at the president's proposal and looking at the money that's already been appropriated, they have reasoned that a lot of that money is going to be spent in the out years. And if you look at the spend rate there, you can see good portion of it happening after 2023 with large investments in 2024 and 2025. So down at the bottom, I've just calculated the estimated total spend for the per year. So, you know, the current year we're in, FY21, CBO thinks that only about 12% of the total will be spent. Next year, 2022, about a quarter, another quarter in 2023, and then it starts coming down in 2024. So real quick, kind of with that background on the supplemental spending that's coming in, the governor's budget recommendation, generally modest increases for the operation costs in K through 12 and higher ed. We see funding built into the foundation grant and the operation line items for colleges and universities. The retirement system, added costs associated with recent reforms across all 3 budgets, an additional $150 million increase. As I pointed out, the original FY21 budget had no COVID spending. That's all in the supplemental. This next round of federal relief will have to be dealt with. It's been somewhat of a sticking point between the governor and the legislature right now. So we'll see how if that becomes an issue when the Biden dollars come in. In terms of specific highlights, the operational funding, the per pupil grant for K through 12, using the 2X formula, those districts that are lower funded will get $164 per pupil increase. Those near the top will get an $82 per pupil increase. The governor, again, is recommending a cut to the cyber school foundation by 20%. I mentioned earlier the declining enrollment money that was included in the 2021 budget. There's a continuation of a declining enrollment appropriation for 2022. The chart on your right basically shows you a history of the pupil membership. That's the student count that's used for state aid purposes. That's the blue line, and you can see it's slowly tracking down up to 2020, and then the huge drop off in 2021 from about 1.46 million kids down to just over 1.4 million kids. If the state had paid on that, that's where you would have seen those declines in school funding, because there's just fewer students available and to pay on. Using the super blend method that was adopted to help shield districts bumped up the enrollment this current year by about 40,000 students. And then coming into 2022, back on the 90-10 traditional blend, still seeing that general decline in student population. I would note that the student estimates show that about 5,000 kids that were enrolled in public schools in 2019 will not be enrolled in 2022. these are the kids, the lost kids, the students that have just checked out of our public education system. So there's a concerted effort funding in the budget to address this. We'll have to see how that plays out. There's a modest funding increase for the 31A categorical. The additional special ed reimbursement payments have been maintained to provide district special ed reimbursement above the 28% threshold that is required under the Durant decision. There's a large increase in the budget for state-funded preschool Great Start Readiness slots. This would align the full day rate in a Great Start program with the same K through 12 foundation, a grant of $82.75. And then there is some one-time funding in the budget for drinking water replacements in schools. So just as I wrap up here, looking forward, some big pictures to think about K through 12. The federal funding is going to be a huge part of the school district finance discussions going forward. The state government job is to appropriate the money. Obviously, local districts are going to be spending a good portion of that. And, while this federal money is coming in to the district budgets, the state is continuing to increase kind of the baseline funding that's going in to K through 12. A number of people have asked, well, what are the prospects for a fiscal cliff similar to what we saw with the Great Recession? I'd point out a few things. One, unlike the Great Recession, school aid revenue is healthy, state appropriations are increasing. The federal dollars that are coming in are not in the current budget, and the current proposals aren't being used to replace state funds, but this is all new spending. So it's not the case that when the federal money goes away, we have to have state money to back it up. No, this is all new spending. And then given the federal spend that I shared with you earlier, the table, it looks like there's going to be a gradual off-ramp because this federal COVID spending peaks in 2022 at 1.7 and then gradually falls to 1.5 billion in 23 and then just a hair under 1 billion in 24. So this suggests to me that the worries of a fiscal cliff, at least as we understood it coming out of the Great Recession, may not materialize. And just a word, as the state moves forward with programming this federal investment, it should keep in mind, what district needs are being met and which ones aren't, and where there is a need and for funding, that the state should look to its limited resources to address those funding gaps. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bob.
Okay, thank you, Craig. As we wrap up, we're going to take a real quick look at some of the big general fund investments in the budget, and then talk about kind of the long-term budget picture looking out into FY23 and structural balance issues that may exist at that time. So one of the governor advanced a supplemental request in early January. Part of that was to recognize some newly available federal stimulus revenues for testing, contact tracing, vaccines, SNAP, our food assistance program, and emergency rental and utility assistance. The legislature has already taken some steps to act on that, and this is one of the early points of contention in budget deliberations. The legislature pushing back to hold back some of that funding and put some conditions on expenditures. We saw this week the legislature, one, earmarked some of this funding, some of the testing funds are earmarked in budget boilerplate for corrections, K-12 schools, nursing facilities, some of the vaccine funds for, earmarked for health providers and local public health departments. And in particular, some sort of conditions on those appropriations. The testing dollars are made contingent upon the enactment of Senate Bill 1, which is a bill pending before the Senate that would limit the governor's ability to extend emergency orders related to pandemic response beyond 28 days without legislative approval. And the vaccine appropriation is appropriated into a reserve fund that also has conditions that before the funds are expended, there needs to be some additional legislative approvals through the legislative transfer process and submission of spend plan details. Another major piece of that supplemental that as proposed by the governor was small business support. The governor's proposal in the January supplemental had $235 million in general fund in three major programs for general business support and $10 million for the safe reopening, specifically of restaurants. The legislature balked at that proposal. In their response, the legislature has instead shifted over to a grant program for 9 different sectors of the economy, which largely revolve around the hospitality industry, entertainment venues, the service sector, and the grant program proposed in the legislative plan is grants that would offer basically tax and fee relief for property taxes paid in 2020, liquor license fees paid in 2020, other licensing and inspection fees paid in 2020, and then up to 50% of UI tax contributions for businesses in those specific sectors. The amount that you would get in terms of a grant would be based on a sliding scale on the gross receipts loss that you experienced in 2020. Basically, the highest quarter in 2020 loss over the same quarter in 2019. So if a business experienced a 50% loss in gross receipts in quarter 2 2020 compared to quarter 2 2019, that would help shape how much of the full grant amount that you received under their plan. Significantly, the legislature, it's been a point of contention, also deposits $150 million in general fund into the UI trust fund. Another major GF proposal was direct worker wage supports. In last year's budget, both using state funds and federal stimulus funds, direct care workers who provide direct services to vulnerable populations in Michigan received a $2 an hour wage increase to help promote attraction and retention of employees in that industry doing very difficult work. The governor's proposal extends that $2 increase permanently. The legislature, in its plan, increases the wage from $2 to $2.25 an hour, and expands the recipients of that increase with some new areas: adult foster care, homes for the aged, supported employment arrangements that would start. Those new recipients would start March 1st, 2021. Also extends a temporary a wage increase to frontline workers in child welfare residential facilities for 5 months at $2 an hour. So that's what's in the current legislative plan compared to what the governor proposed. $300 million in general fund one time is proposed in the governor's supplemental proposal for local bridge repair. Goal is to, by next spring, repair or replace 120 local bridges that are in the most serious situation, either serious or critical. There's an estimate that over 1,000 bridges are currently in that poor, serious, or critical range as of the last data from MDOT from 2018. An expansion of child care supports. The state administers a child care daycare support, subsidy support program for low-income households that need to access daycare in order to enter training or employment. This would, through FY22, raise the income eligibility level for daycare subsidies to 200% of the poverty level. That would fall back after FY22 under the governor's proposal to 160% of the federal poverty level. Also increases provider reimbursement rates for those daycare providers under that program. And significantly to those daycare providers, it would call for them through this calendar year to be paid on enrollment instead of actual daily attendance. So if you're a daycare provider and Billy is absent from daycare one day, you wouldn't get the state subsidy under the way things are paid now. With this special relief being proposed in the governor's proposal, that would allow for reimbursement based on slots or enrollment instead. That total over FY21 and 2022 costs about $350 million, and most of that comes from federal stimulus funding. The 22 budget contains enough to cover the remaining amount from one-time general fund finances. We are on the precipice of, it seems likely, receiving significantly more federal stimulus. The U.S. House acted last week in its version of the latest federal stimulus bill to include $350 billion for states and locals in order to provide additional stimulus for states and local units of government. If that stays in the final version, which seems likely right now, Michigan would get $5.7 billion, according to the estimates provided by the Federal Funds Information for States Organization, and municipalities and counties in Michigan would be receiving $4.4 billion. That's a lot of money. $5.7 billion to Michigan is, it's roughly half of 1 year's worth of general funds. So we could be seeing much more money come in the door. We'll see what the U.S. Senate finalizes in its meetings now. Let's wrap up by looking ahead to 2023. This slide shows a quick projection of GFGP balances going forward. You note again in FY22 a big $1 billion balance in general fund coming into the year in which we're budgeting for right now. But notice ongoing revenues are down from estimated expenditures under the governor's budget proposal by $1 billion. So we eat up that fund balance. So we only have $61 million coming into the next year. While there is revenue growth and those ongoing revenues go up by a couple $100 million, the same is true with expenditures. We have pressures from losing that enhanced Medicaid match that's still built into the budget, regular inflationary payroll costs for state employees, and other kind of fund shifts that are built in that'll have the will result in some baseline cost pressures to the general fund. If we look at the 2023 budget scenario, just looking at those cost pressures, we have a hole of about $378 million. And that assumes all that one-time appropriations that we've talked about in part for the general fund, that those do go away. We don't retain any of those appropriations going forward. Employment growth, just as a quick note, growth continues. We get healthy growth in employment, but it does not get back. Note in 2029, Michigan had just over 4.4 million jobs. The current projections call for that to reach about 4.3 million jobs in 2023. So even with projections for some recovery, employment's going to remain below the high water mark in 2019. Biggest uncertainty right now: when does the pandemic end? We see we have structural general fund shortfall, but a lot of uncertainty about the pandemic and the economy. They're going to shape those economic and revenue numbers. You know, the key point that we talked about earlier, state revenue losses in FY20 and 21 that were projected ended up being mitigated largely by federal stimulus. How quick, you know, questions of how quickly after the pandemic, when does it end? To how quickly does the economy return to normal after the pandemic ends? And then to what extent and for how long does some of that federal stimulus that we saw help prop up state revenues, how long does that continue after the pandemic ends? We could be in the unusual situation of the public health emergency ends, the federal stimulus ends, but we're still trailing, we're still catching up economically, and that makes things worse in terms of the state budget and revenue picture. When we're looking at, you know, the current surplus that we have, and then even more so maybe these federal stimulus dollars that appear to be on the horizon, a big question for not only the governor, once we find out how much we indeed will be getting from Washington in the next round of stimulus, you know, how much of this do we spend on sort of, you know, transformative one-time investments, and how much of it should we think about saving to mitigate maybe the risks that come with some of the uncertainty about the end of the pandemic and the recovery of the economy. So that concludes our budget webinar. Appreciate your participation today. I am going to turn it back over to
Bob. Why don't
John.
I jump in here?
Sure, Eric.
Yeah, we ran a little bit longer than we anticipated. Why don't we plan on 10 minutes of Q&A, John and Kyle? And we know people have busy days and they need to move on, but there are a few good questions. So why don't we tackle those?
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Kyle, you're muted.
Oh.
There we go.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. I want to start with one that, you know, in the 30 years I've been around Lansing, I don't think I've ever seen so big of an influx of federal resources at one time. Are we getting to the point where we're getting too much relief? And I guess, are the systems we have, K through 12 system and the state system, capable of spending that much money at once? What are the safeguards? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Craig, do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
Sure, I'll give a go. Yeah, a lot of money. Most of my comments were the massive amount of money that we'll be investing in the K through 12 system. You know, contrasted with the last time we got a big influx of resources, that was to kind of backfill state revenues. This is clearly for new investment because of the nature of the pandemic. I would point out that that $6.2 billion that I've been talking about is not uniformly distributed. There are a number of districts, because of the nature of the formula, that receive considerable more than other districts. Some districts receive virtually nothing from these packages. So, you know, to answer your question, our district's going to be, it depends on where you sit, depends on the nature of the, you know, the as you kind of point out, a problem with this or potential problem. Personally, I can see an issue with staffing. If schools decide that they're going to reduce class sizes, add tutors, they're going to be needing new people to fill these positions. We currently have a shortage in a number of K through 12 teaching positions, as well as administrative positions. And as I mentioned in my comments, all of those dollars are going to be keep chasing the same services, the same people. So I do see some challenges with spending down the federal education dollars, at least in the short period, which is kind of the expectation.
And on the general fund side, and I think we've identified how we'll spend the dollars we have in the door now. If we get $5 billion or more of new federal revenue, there will need to be a careful process as to how you want to spend, or the extent you want to make sure you hold some money back to deal with uncertainties that may, as we saw how quickly things changed in FY20 from where we thought we were to where we really were. It's possible the same thing could happen in reverse in 2023. So it may be wise to actually hold back some of that money. But there are a lot of one-time investments, infrastructure in our, Craig talked about the K-12 system, but behavioral health system. There are a lot of ways the state could do good with additional dollars, even if they're dollars on a one-time basis.
My question would be, what are some of the pitfalls or some of the concerns or I guess things that the state should be looking out for with all this federal money, whether it be concerns about locals squandering the money or inflationary problems? Is there problems attached with having this kind of influx of money all at one time?
I'll quickly chime in, Kyle, and just say my recommendation in the chart is for the state to hold back its investment in some of these K-12 programs to see how the federal money shakes out and where the need is. So that would be my advice. In addition to the challenges I've already noted about the same dollars chasing more or less the same people, the same contractors to serve in the same, if you're thinking teachers, labor market, Detroit is a labor market. There's the Detroit Public School District, but then there's 100 charter schools within the city of Detroit that operate, sometimes all independently of DPSCD and sometimes independently of each other. They're all going to be scrambling for the same services and the same personnel as DPSCD does.
Right. And I think on the general fund side that that the biggest challenge up front will be just trying to put together a process to determine what the budget planning for how this goes out, and then the hurdles that you'll need to leap in order to spend a lot of new money will depend on what area you determine to invest in. But to me, on the general funds side of things, the challenge for the state and local governments that will be getting a lot of money will be to quickly triage. We have all this one-time money. What are our highest priority needs that we need to that we should invest in, and evaluating what should be, as Craig said, kind of held back for future risks.
We have a question from Dave Whitmer, who was generous enough to sponsor this podcast. I want to make sure we ask that one. Thank you to him for his support. Can you discuss our overall taxation level versus Headley and on the state and local combined compared to 20 years ago?
Yeah, so we are well below the Headley limit, and I will let if Craig or Eric happen to know the exact number. When the Headley limitation was put in place, I believe we're still $9 or $10 billion below the limit that was established at that time, and I'm afraid I don't have that number at my fingertips. I don't know if either Craig or Eric does, but that would be a quick lookup. But when the Headley limitation was put in place, I think it was envisioning being a constraint on state revenue growth. In reality, we are well below that Headley limit still. To the tune of close to probably in the range of $10 billion.
Yeah. So, John, two comments. Bob, the number is about 12.5 billion this year.
Okay.
Ramps up to 14 billion next year. The 2 points I make on this when I hear this question, John, are one, the piece we just talked about, the 12 billion above the limit. That's the current estimate. But for people who've been around and we were at the limit during our lifetime. This has been we've lived within the limit to the point where we had too much money and had to do a temporary income tax rebate. And now we're at the point where we're 12.5. So we've lived in both extremes. I don't have a value to say was my life or was Michigan better when we were at the limit versus today. But I would point that out in the period since Proposal A, which is kind of the marker for, how we determine, at least now that school funding is under the state kind of authority, we've been at that, we were at that limit in the late 90s. And since then we've been on a pretty steady trend towards being well below it.
What about the fixing the damn roads? There's no money that we can get from the federal government or that they're sending us that we can put into the roads, is there?
We have gotten money from the federal government for transportation infrastructure, which has been helpful. But the governor in her original budget proposal, when she was first elected, called for the increase in the in transportation revenues and the gasoline tax increase. That didn't happen, and that budget 2 budgets ago, the state has looked to bond then to try to cover some of those road infrastructure needs, in the meantime. In this budget, I think the biggest investment is that $300 million for local bridges, and the bonding money that's a fix for that problem now is helping on the state side. That $300 million would address locally owned bridges, but that problem hasn't gone away. We still have a structural issue with road infrastructure needs exceeding our revenues. And I'll certainly let my colleagues add to that if they wish.
I don't have anything to add, but I think maybe in the spirit of one last question, I'll combine 2 that have been asked online as we've been talking. Both relate to productive use of this money that's now available to us. One mentions the retirement systems and maybe paying down some of that debt that would free up future money. And the other ones, while we've just talked about the road infrastructure, clearly we have a problem with dams, and there's been a lot of studies since the Gladwin, the failure of those dams, about how many more are not in great shape. So let's address both retirement cost and infrastructure as our last question.
Right. So I mean, if we get $5.5 billion in new federal revenue on the state level from the federal stimulus, in its one time in nature, infrastructure would seem to be a very appropriate and probably a very wise use of a chunk of that money. And I think we need to get we'd need to see final guidance. To me, we'd need to see final guidance from the federal government on the new stimulus dollars as to how it can be used. You know, it's clear we can address COVID economic impact, negative economic impact from COVID. We can address revenue losses, which we couldn't under the first round of coronavirus relief fund from COVID. It's not clear whether, at least this, you know, the new pot of money that may be on its way from the federal government could be sunk into the retirement system. Whether that would be an eligible use. Infrastructure. You know, it would seem like a good way to use one-time money. Craig, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I would just point out that all the education money in the Biden plan is required to be used by schools for education related to COVID and learning loss, kind of going forward. So I don't see paying down pension debt with the COVID dollars, the federal relief funds, as a viable option.
All right, so let's end it with that. I'd like to thank Bob and Craig for presenting. As I mentioned, this has all been recorded and it will be posted on our website under the events tab. It takes a little while to process, but within 2 hours or so, it should be done. We will also distribute this via email, let people know that link is available. Thank you to Carol and John as well for co-hosting and for these questions. We look forward to future webinars and hearing back any feedback you have when the email goes out asking for your thoughts on how this went. Everybody have a great weekend. Stay safe. Virus is on the way. The vaccine is on the way. Virus has been here. So let's stay safe until we can all get that vaccine. Thank you all.